December 1764 descended upon the British colonies with a biting physical cold that matched the chill in the political atmosphere. As the year drew to a close, the 13 colonies found themselves in a strange, suspended state of existence. The guns of the Great Indian War had finally fallen silent in the West, and the harvest was in the barns in the South. On the surface, it was a time of peace. But every ship that docked in Boston, New York, or Philadelphia brought confirmation that this peace was merely an interlude. The news of December was not of battles fought, but of battles being prepared. In the coffeehouses of London, the ministry was finalizing the text of the Stamp Act. In the farmhouses of New England, families were counting their dwindling shillings and deciding to forego British cloth for Christmas. In the deep woods of the Ohio, the British Army was marching home, leaving behind a chastised but resentful enemy. December 1764 marked the psychological end of the colonial era and the beginning of the revolutionary era. It was the month when the colonists stopped waiting for things to go back to normal and started realizing that the new empire was here to stay. It was a month of endings, the end of the war, the end of the economic boom, and the end of the trust that had bound the colonies to the mother country for over a century. The most visceral drama of the month played out in the frozen wilderness of western Pennsylvania and the Ohio country. The Southern Army under Colonel Henry Bouquet spent December conducting one of the most difficult logistical feats of the war, bringing the army and the captives home. In November, Bouquet had forced the Delaware and Shawnee tribes to surrender their white captives at the forks of the Muskingum River. Now in December, the army had to get them back to civilization. The march back to Fort Pitt, which is modern-day Pittsburgh, was brutal. The winter set in early. The trails were slick with ice and mud. The army, consisting of British regulars, the Royal Americans and the Black Watch, and the provincial militia, had to act as nursemaids as well as soldiers. The column included hundreds of recovered prisoners, men, women, and children. Many were malnourished, others were emotionally shattered. The news that filtered back to the settlements described the strange melancholy of the procession. There were children who tried to run away, back to their Indian families, and had to be bound. There were women who wept silently for the Indian husbands that they were forced to leave behind. By December 25th, the bulk of the expedition had made it back to the safety of Fort Pitt. It was a somber Christmas. There were no great celebrations, only the relief of survival. Bouquet did not trust the peace. He brought back with him several high-ranking Indian chiefs as hostages to be held at Fort Pitt until the tribes delivered the remaining captives in the spring. In December, the frontier was technically at peace, but it was an armed truce. The garrisons at Fort Pitt, Fort Ligonier, and Fort Bedford were doubled. The sentries looked out over the snow-covered woods, knowing that the Shawnee were angry and hungry. The war was over, but the hatred remained. As the expedition wound down in late December, the Pennsylvania and Virginia provincial troops began to be discharged. These men returned to their farms in Lancaster, Cumberland, and Augusta counties. They brought their muskets home, along with a deep sense of validation. They had forced the savages to heal. This reinforced the political power of the frontier counties, the very men who had supported the Paxton Boys riots earlier in the year. They returned home feeling like the saviors of the colony, further alienating the pacifist Quaker elite in Philadelphia. While Bouquet marched through the snow, a different kind of warrior arrived in the fog of London. Benjamin Franklin, the newly appointed agent for Pennsylvania and de facto spokesman for America, stepped ashore in December. Franklin's crossing had been remarkably fast, a mere 30 days from Chester, Pennsylvania to Portsmouth, England. He arrived on December 10th, 1764. He immediately went to his old lodgings at 36 Craven Street. The news of his arrival spread quickly through the circle of American colonial agents and the scientific community of the Royal Society. Franklin had left Philadelphia with one goal: to overthrow the Penn family and make Pennsylvania a royal colony. But upon landing in December, he was immediately confronted with a much bigger problem. Almost immediately, Franklin was thrust into the crisis of the Stamp Act. Prime Minister George Grenville had given the colonial agents a year to come up with an alternative to the stamp tax. That year was almost up. In his initial meetings in late December, Franklin realized the grim truth. Grenville had no intention of backing down. The alternative offer had been a trap. Since the colonies had not agreed on a single unified plan to tax themselves, which was impossible given their bickering, Grenville felt justified in imposing the tax himself. Franklin spent the last weeks of December furiously writing and meeting with other agents, like Richard Jackson. He began a pivot from a loyal petitioner to a reluctant obstructionist. He advised his friends in America to frugality and industry, signaling that political arguments were failing and economic pain might be the only weapon left. In Boston, Newport, and Portsmouth, December 1764 was a month of economic despair. The Sugar Act was now fully operational. The Currency Act was strangling credit, and the post-war depression was hitting rock bottom. The Boston Gazettes in December were filled with notices of insolvency. One of the biggest shocks was the failure of Nathaniel Wheelwright, a prominent merchant. When he stopped payment in late 1764 and early 1765, it triggered a domino effect. Shopkeepers, artisans, and even widows who had lent him money were ruined. Because of the Currency Act, there was no paper money to pay debts. Because of the trade slump, there was no silver. In December, commerce simply stopped. Neighbors bartered cordwood for corn. The cash economy of the port cities reverted to a medieval system of trade. The cultural reaction to this poverty was the non-consumption movement. By December, the agreements signed in the summer and autumn were biting. It became a point of social shame to wear new British finery. The news in the social columns was of wealthy families holding quiet, austere holiday gatherings. The spinners, women making their own thread, were the heroines of the season. This austerity was not just about saving money. It was about hurting Britain. Every yard of cloth not bought was a protest. The gloom of the December economy was being transformed into a weapon of resistance. News arrived in late December that the Massachusetts petition against the Sugar Act, sent earlier in the year, had been largely ignored by the Board of Trade. This failure of the polite approach hardened the resolve of men like Samuel Adams. If petitions didn't work, and economic logic didn't work, then perhaps the mob tactics of Pope's Day on November 5th were the only language that London understood. The seeds of the violent resistance of 1765 were watered by the silence of London in December of 1764. In the Hudson Valley and the disputed Hampshire grants, which were Vermont, December was a month of legal and physical conflict. While the city merchants fought the Sugar Act, the rural counties of New York were fighting a class war. Vast swaths of the Hudson Valley were owned by a few aristocratic families like the Livingstons and the Van Cortlands and the Van Rensselaers. The farmers were tenants, often living in feudal-like conditions. Emboldened by the talk of liberty and rights regarding the British taxes, the tenants began to ask a dangerous question. If the king can't tax the lords without consent, why can the lords tax us? In late 1764, a leader named William Prendergast was beginning to organize the tenants. Though the full rent war would erupt in 1766, The organizing meetings took place in the barns of Dutchess and Westchester counties during the long nights of December 1764. In the Green Mountains, the snow did not stop the New York sheriffs. Armed with the King's July decree awarding the land to New York officials continued to harass the settlers who held titles from New Hampshire. In December, the leaders of Bennington, including the Allen family, met to discuss their defense. They resolved that they would not pay for their land twice. They began to stockpile powder and shot. The Green Mountain Boys were being born in the fires of this winter. In Virginia and the Carolinas, the mild winter allowed for a different kind of activity. In Williamsburg, the planter elite gathered for the holiday season, but the balls and dinners masked a terrifying secret. John Robinson, the Speaker of the House and Treasurer, was frantically trying to juggle the colony's books. He had loaned out more than 100,000 pounds of redeemed paper money to his friends instead of burning it as required by the law. In December 1764, as the British merchants demanded payment in sterling due to the Currency Act, the pressure on Robinson's debtors became unbearable. They couldn't pay him back, which meant that he couldn't balance the books. The entire economy of Virginia was built on a fraud that was inches away from being exposed. In the background, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry was gaining fame. In December, he was riding the circuit speaking for the common man against the aristocrats. He was the match waiting for the Robinson powder keg. In Charleston, John Stuart, Superintendent of Indian Affairs, spent December working to secure the southern frontier. Intelligence reports in December suggested that French agents, refusing to accept the surrender, were still operating among the Creeks and Cherokees, urging them to rise up like Pontiac. Stuart managed to hold the line. By using the news of Bouquet's victory in the north, he convinced the Cherokee chiefs that war with Britain was suicide. The southern frontier remained quiet in December, allowing the colony to export a bumper crop of rice. The American news of December 1764 cannot be understood without looking at the West Indies. The Sugar Act was being enforced with brutal efficiency in the Caribbean. British naval vessels were seizing American sloops in Kingston and Bridgetown for the slightest paperwork violations. This cut off the flow of hard currency, as in Spanish dollars, to the mainland. In December, the merchants of Philadelphia and Boston felt the squeeze not just from London, but from Jamaica. The triangular trade was effectively broken. For the first time, the white planters of the West Indies began to grumble in unison with the mainland colonists. They too were being squeezed. Letters of sympathy passed between Kingston and Charleston in December, weaving the Caribbean into the web of colonial resistance. In New England, where the Puritan legacy still held sway, Christmas was not legally separated. It was seen as popish. However, December 1764 saw a subtle shift. The growing presence of British officials and the Anglicanization of the elite meant that in Boston and New York, Christmas 1764 was celebrated with more pomp than in previous years. Church services, feasts, and decorations. This created tension. The radical Puritans, or New Lights, saw these celebrations as a sign of moral decay and British tyranny. The fight over Christmas was a proxy for the fight over culture. To celebrate Christmas was to be a Tory. To ignore it was to be a patriot. By December, the great smallpox epidemic of Boston was officially history. The final numbers were being analyzed by the doctors. The success of the general inoculation was the talk of the scientific community. The city was seasoned. The survivors were immune. This came with a grim military utility. If war came, the Boston population would not be wiped out by disease in the camps. The epidemic had hardened the population physically, just as the tax crisis was hardening them politically. The output of colonial printers reached a fever pitch in December. The most popular book in any colonial home was the almanac for the coming year. In December 1764, the almanacs, like Poor Richard's successors, were filled with maxims about industry, frugality, and liberty. They were not just weather guides, they were political primers. The Otis and Thatcher pamphlets were being reprinted and sold in the thousands. Literacy was high, and in the long winter nights of December, the colonists were reading. They were educating themselves on the British Constitution so that they could dismantle it. As the sun set on December 31st, 1764, the 13 colonies were radically different than they had been on January 1st. First, there was the transformation of loyalty. In January, the colonists were proud Britons, flush with the victory of the 7 Years' War. In December, they were suspicious subjects, viewing the British flag not as a banner of protection, but as a symbol of extraction. The mother country had become a stepmother. Then there was the unification of grievance. In January, a Virginian cared little for the problems of a Bostonian. In December, the Sugar Act and the proposed Stamp Act had given them a common enemy. The committees of correspondence were weaving a net of communication that spanned the continent. And then there was the end of the native threat. In January, the frontier was in flames. In December, the fires were out. The defeat of the Ohio tribes removed the one great external threat that had forced the colonies to rely on the British Army. With the French gone and the Indians subdued, the colonists no longer needed British protection. And if they didn't need protection, then why should they pay for it? December of 1764 was the quiet before the storm. The ships carrying the Stamp Act were being readied in the Thames. The mobs were organizing in the taverns of Boston. The orators were sharpening their quills in Virginia. The year ended in silence, but it was the heavy, pressurized silence of a fuse burning down. The explosion of 1765 was inevitable. The American Revolution had not yet begun in blood, but in the minds of the people, it was already underway.